everybody. Thanks for being here today. I'm Claire Pace. I'm a project scientist with UC Berkeley's Water Equity Science Shop. And I'm going to tell you today about our research on PFAS-contaminated pesticides applied near public supply wells in California. So our research group, WES, is a community academic collaboration between UC Berkeley, UCLA, Cal EPA's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and the Community Water Center, which is an environmental justice and advocacy group. Together, we support equitable implementation of California's Human Right to Water law. So today, I'm going to talk about how PFAS may be getting into pesticides, where these PFAS pesticides may be entering our water supply. I'll talk about why this is an environmental justice issue, and how our research fits into this. So there's been a lot of media attention around PFAS recently. This is a timeline specific to PFAS in pesticides. So between 2018 and 2020, researchers from Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER, detected PFAS in the insecticide Anvil 1010 and in water systems that were near places where Anvil had been sprayed aerially. This first came to light in southern Massachusetts, and it was later determined that these had been applied in at least 24 other states. So this led to an EPA investigation which did not detect PFAS in these same pesticide samples. And it led to a follow-up study that suggested that the primary source of the PFAS in pesticides were the containers that they were stored in. So then in 2021, and in 2022, PFAS were detected in more pesticides by several research efforts, including a paper in the Journal of Hazardous Substances, which was led by a former EPA researcher. Where was I? Let's see. Followed most recently by PEER, issuing an information quality complaint against the EPA, claiming that there were some issues with the reports that were issued by the EPA in 2021. So meanwhile, within all of this, we have had a federally recognized PFAS MCL, and our study conducted research on spatial distribution of PFAS pesticides in California. So the conversation is still going on about where the source of PFAS is coming from in pesticides, but suffice it to say that it's an ongoing conversation. So let's just talk for a minute about the EPA's explanation of how PFAS are getting into pesticides. So this research and then a follow-up study from Notre Dame found that the surface fluorination of high-density polyethylene plastic results in these unintentional production of PFAS. So in this process, post-fabricated HDPE plastic, or plastic number 2, it's put in a chamber, it's bombarded with fluorine gas under high temperature, it reacts with the oxygen, and it creates this barrier. According to the plastic industry, these containers offer high-performance barrier properties thanks to their fluorination. This is advertised as a solution to the plastic paneling problem. This is just an ad I pulled offline this week. So unfortunately, it also results in leached PFAS into whatever happens to be in the container. And even worse, these are containers that are being used for food, makeup, household cleaners, shampoos, etc. So we're talking about plastics with plastic recycling number 2. And I want to mention not all number 2 plastic is fluorinated, but there's currently no way to tell from the container itself whether it was fluorinated or not. Okay, so how much leaching are we talking about? Well, a study out of Notre Dame that confirmed the EPA findings that fluorinated plastic leaches PFAS into solvents. They detected PFAS in samples of many substances, including water, after just 1 week of leaching. The EPA and Notre Dame study also showed that time, temperature, and corrosiveness of product increased the amount of leaching that was happening. So fluorination of HDPE is a major problem. Even if the storage containers were the only source of PFAS in pesticides, we'd still have a pretty big problem, or huge problem, because the US produces 10 billion tons of HDPE plastic per year, and over 200 million HDPE containers are fluorinated every year. There's also evidence that there are other sources of PFAS in pesticides. For example, the US uses a pretty narrow definition of what constitutes a PFAS. And we have lack of monitoring of inert ingredients. Currently, just the active ingredients are tested for safety, not the final formulation. In other words, our study looked at a very small part of a much larger problem. Here I'm just showing some of the potential routes of exposure and the small piece that we investigated in this study. So this research was published last month in ES&T Water in a special issue on emerging contaminants in agroecosystems. We estimated how much PFAS was present in pesticides based on published reports. We estimated where these pesticides were applied and whether the impacted communities differed across lines of race and class. Our hypothesis was that Latinx and non-Latinx communities of color would experience disproportionate impacts. And that hypothesis was based on what we know about water quality of other regulated contaminants, what we know about disparate impacts of pesticide application in general, and what we already know about distributive aspects of environmental justice. For example, proximity of toxic sites to vulnerable communities. So we used the pesticide use reporting database and published reports of PFAS concentrations in each of the products to calculate the total statewide application of PFAS within each 1 by 1 mile grid square for the state. Next, we took those 1 by 1 mile grid squares. We intersected them with the locations of public supply wells. And those are the wells that serve public water systems. And we generated 1 kilometer buffers around each of the public supply wells. And then we used aerial apportionment to estimate the amount of PFAS that was applied in close proximity to those public supply wells. And we selected that 1 kilometer buffer based on Cal EPA's methods for Cal Enviro Screen. And then we assigned those values to the water system's service area boundaries. Next, we used sociodemographic characteristics from the American Community Survey in order to determine the population characteristics of each water system. So here I'm showing the water system boundary, an example of a census block, and the variables that we used from the American Community Survey. We found that over 200,000 milligrams of PFAS may have been applied over the study period near public supply wells. We found that this specific source of PFAS is likely to have impacted 30% of groundwater-reliant systems, and that these systems themselves are serve 18.5 million Californians. We ran 2-part conditional autoregressive models, and we looked at the linear relationship between PFAS and sociodemographic characteristics in our Part 1 models. And in Part 2, we looked at the odds of PFAS pesticide application. In order to account for spatial dependence in the data, we included spatial random effects and also adjusted for region. So these are our Part 1 log linear results. The null is indicated by the dashed line at 1. And we found that water systems that serve a higher proportion of Latinx and non-Latinx people of color received more PFAS pesticides. Specifically, a 10% increase in the proportion of Latinx residents at the community water system scale was associated with a 27% increase in the milligrams of PFAS applied per square kilometer. Our logistic regression looked at the odds of PFAS pesticides, and we found a 60% increased odds for every 10% increase in the proportion of Latinx residents. I want to make sure it's clear that we're looking at differences in community level racial ethnic composition and not at biological race. The mechanism that we believe underlies this relationship is structural racism, which can lead to differences in one's experiences across their lifetime based on perceived race and ethnicity. We also realize that race is not a proxy for racism, and that even race is a social construct that shifts over time. For example, as of 2023, the US Census Office of Management and Budget suggested the addition of a Middle Eastern or North African racial category. And this would change the way that we measure and the way that we categorize. And it might change the results of a study, but it obviously doesn't change anything about the underlying population. So some take-home points. PFAS contamination is a serious problem and an environmental justice issue. The fluorination process is part of the problem for PFAS and pesticides. But contaminated pesticides are just one of many environmental sources of PFAS. We need more research, advocacy, regulation, better coordination in order to tackle this problem. So with regard to our own next steps, our lab is conducting a water sampling study in partnership with Community Water Center and Silent Spring Institute. We're collecting drinking water samples from 100 households in rural and agricultural parts of California. These samples are going to be tested for a panel of 70 PFAS. And we're also conducting non-targeted analysis, looking for unknown unknowns, which we've heard a lot about today. So the testing includes domestic well households and small water systems. And as a side note, domestic wells in California serve an estimated 1.6 million Californians, and these are water sources that are not regulated and not technically subject to the new PFAS MCL. We are also looking forward to evaluating our maps compared to the waterborne samples that'll be coming out soon. And we think it's really important to consider other agricultural sources of PFAS in the environment. Other inert ingredients, other things like biosolids that we've also heard about today. And with that, I would just like to thank my co-authors and our research team and funders. And I think we're taking questions later.